Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Frontline Club. My name is Adam Roberts. I'm a journalist with The Economist. I was based in Johannesburg for 4 years, from 2001 to 2005. I used to report from Zimbabwe now and then, sometimes welcomed by the government, sometimes not. We've got a great panel tonight. I, first of all, should give apologies from Bafor and Koma, who was supposed to be here to give his perspective on things, but he's had to go to Zimbabwe. So he's doing some reporting from there. But to my immediate left is Christina Lamb, an award-winning journalist and a Zimbabwe specialist, also an Afghanistan specialist. Her story, she works for the Sunday Times, and she's written a book called The House of Stone, which is published by HarperCollins. Christina has been going to Zimbabwe on and off since 1994, and was last in the country in September 2007. To her left is Gugulethu Moyo from Zimbabwe. Gugulethu is a lawyer with the International Bar Association and a commentator on Zimbabwe. She's a human rights activist, and she too has written a book called The Day After Mugabe, which is published by the Africa Research Institute. And to Gugu's left is Tererai Karimakweda. Have I said that right?
Something like that.
Okay. Also from Zimbabwe, he's also a journalist with SW Radio Africa, now based in London, but previously Tererai made documentaries in Zimbabwe, and his radio broadcasts are broadcast into Zimbabwe today. Tonight's discussion is about Zimbabwe's elections and whether Mugabe will win again. If I can just start by recalling 2005 and the parliamentary elections. I was there. I'm not sure who else on our panel might have been there as well. At the end of the parliamentary elections, ZANU-PF won, surprise, surprise, and Robert Mugabe called a press conference at State House, and I went along and others went along to the press conference, and I remember Mugabe was sitting there between two rather tatty lions, stuffed lions, and we all threw questions at him, and one question that we put to him was, he was an old man, he was 82 or so then, and we asked, how old would you be when you stepped down from office? And his response was that he would be 100 years old, he would be a century old. And at the time we laughed and thought this was a joke, but as time passes we realized it probably wasn't. So the theme for tonight, and maybe my first question to each of the panelists, is whether you expect Robert Mugabe to be in office until he's 100 years old. Christina, do you want to begin?
Yeah. I mean, I think we've kind of constantly underestimated Mugabe and not taken him at his word when he's said things like that, and then he has gone on to do these things. I mean, the first thing I would say is that Mugabe doesn't lose elections. He lost the referendum in '99, but he's certainly made sure that he won't lose anything since. So I find it quite difficult to imagine that these elections at the end of March are really going to end up changing anything. Having said that, I have just come back from Pakistan, where everybody expected the elections to be rigged, and surprise, surprise, they were more or less free and fair, and have changed things. There will be an opposition government. It probably won't last very long, I think, but it's shown that sometimes elections in countries where you don't expect them to be fair can be. And so is a reason for hope. Another reason for hope, of course, is the emergence of Simba Makoni as a candidate, and somebody coming from within ZANU-PF itself. I guess we'll probably go into that later on, so I won't say too much about that now. I mean, obviously there's a lot of questions about who is supporting him. He's appeared on his own. He claims to have the backing of lots of people from within ZANU-PF, but none of these people have actually physically appeared next to him. So quite what impact that will make, and the danger is that he will end up dividing the opposition votes. So I guess I fear that Mugabe isn't going to lose this election because he can't afford to lose it. He has nowhere else to go. The days where dictators ended up in kind of comfortable retirement in south of France have really ended since the founding of the International Criminal Court, which Gugu might have things to say about that. But so I just don't see, he can't just step down and go and live somewhere quietly, because he has a lot of blood on his hands, and it's also not just him. There are a lot of other people around him as kind of mafia running the country. So My hope is that something like Pakistan will happen and surprise us, but I suspect that won't happen.
Thank you, Christina. Gugu, what's your view? Do you think there's any chance that the election will be free and fair?
Well, you know, a day after the nomination court closed in Zimbabwe, the Herald ran a headline, ZANU-PF takes an early lead. And that was really about two constituencies in which you know, ZANU-PF had registered and no other party had registered. So that gives you an indication of what is going on. You know, the media, the only media that most people receive, is cheering for Mugabe. The Electoral Commission itself, which is supposed to be running the election, has gone along with Mugabe's agenda. He announced that elections will be on the 29th of November. This was before constituency boundaries had actually been announced. So people who wanted to participate in the elections at that point didn't know what constituencies would exist. According to the legislation, they ought to have, in fact, waited until the boundaries were determined before announcing an election. Right. Some of the candidates challenged that, or at least one candidate has actually challenged that in court, Jonathan Moyo. The electoral court sat, heard his case and said they would decide the next day. They still haven't decided that. Right. And the nomination process has closed. And of course, Mugabe appoints that electoral court. You know, I could go on about how the environment is skewed in his favor, but and Mugabe has won every election since 1980. But this is an election like no other for him. I think he's going into this in a very weak position. Why? Because in the past, you know, the whole ZANU-PF machinery has focused on rigging that election, on winning that election, certainly in the years where they've had to rig it to win it. This time around, ZANU-PF is divided, and it's quite clear that there are people within ZANU-PF who want Mugabe to go, and they've actually not only want him to go, but they're willing to make a move to make that happen. So it is very different. Also, I think there's pressure on SADC, which got involved in the Zimbabwean situation in March, and Mr. Mbeki said, you know, his target or his objective was to have a free and fair election in Zimbabwe. It looks like it's not happening, and he's under a lot of pressure. So they're going to have to do something about that. So, you know, for Mugabe, this is an election like no other, right. Certainly.
Tererai, do you think that Mugabe is more vulnerable in this election than he's been previously?
Oh, sorry. I'm one of those people that for a long time, you know, we came here to open this radio station 6 years ago. And for a long time, I was an optimist. You know, I didn't unpack my clothes till about 2 years ago. Because for 4 years, I refused to. I kept believing he's going, Mugabe is going. And then I learned one thing, which I think Christina touched on, which is quite clear. Mugabe tells you verbally what he's going to do, and he sticks to it. He said, Zimbabwe will never be recolonized again. He has said this time and time again. And he views the opposition as puppets of the West, and these are the people that he's talking about, that if they were in power would colonize Zimbabwe. Two, he's learned that dictators, whatever promises may be made to them, they don't always work out, you know, hence Charles Taylor. I mean, the guy was made promises, wound up in Nigeria, and then Nigeria was pressured to turn him over. He wound up running to the border with a sack full of cash. Mugabe cannot imagine himself in that position, and he's not ready to go. So yeah, I finally unpacked, and I'm telling you, I'm staying for a while. I might as well start making friends because he's not, he's not going anywhere. I mean, I laughed about this for a long time, and as I ran up the stairs just now, I was cursing, you know, none other than Robert Mugabe, because my whole life for the last 6 years has to do with Zimbabwe. I can't go anywhere where people find out where I come from without them asking me about the situation, and you know, I find myself having to explain no matter where I am, on the tube, on a bus, in a shop. The minute they know you're from Zimbabwe, oh, that Robert Mugabe. So your whole life becomes that. But if you look at what he said, it's one thing. Now, what's on the ground is ridiculous. It's embarrassing. It makes me so upset when I think that this guy is extremely well educated, that he can give a speech as brilliant as the one that he gave at the United Nations this last time. You know, although it was all nonsense, it had nothing to do with the price of bread in Zimbabwe. But it was just one of those really cleverly well done situations where he even drifted into Latin and all of this. Now, curses the British who educated him. And I think Molethi Mbeki put it best, Thabo Mbeki's brother, who I interviewed last week. He said Mugabe is a miniature Englishman. He fancies himself as a miniature Englishman. These guys have become the elitists that they replaced. So you've got apartheid all over again, but in the hands of black people doing this to their own. He's not going anywhere, and I believe that he's here to stay. If he needed or if he wanted to provide a free and fair election, we would have had an independent electoral commission. We don't have that. The Zimbabwe Electoral Commission that is setting up the entire process right now is broke. It's full of people that were appointed by Mugabe. They did the delimitation exercise, moving constituency boundaries around by themselves, and up until now, have they even published the new boundaries yet?
They have.
No.
People still don't know which wards or constituencies they fall under. So there's no way we can have, I mean, anyone who would think that we can is not aware of what's happening on the ground. And this is why I was disappointed by Simba Makoni on the BBC interview this morning. He says, yeah, there's a prospect that we might have a free and fair election. And I wondered which Zimbabwe he's been visiting, because there's no way that each Zimbabwe can have a free and fair election.
Well, can we focus in on that question then, the Simba factor? I mean, is Simba Makoni more of a threat to ZANU-PF and splitting that party, or is he more of a threat to the opposition and splitting the vote against ZANU-PF and against Mugabe? Christina,
I mean, the opposition seem to be well able to cause damage to themselves without Simba Makoni getting involved. I think it's one of the frustrations of covering Zimbabwe has been that the MDC haven't managed in all this awful situation, this country with the world's highest inflation, the lowest birth rate, the lowest life expectancy, so many awful things, and yet the opposition can't actually get their act together and unite and fight against it. So I think that had happened before Simba Makoni emerged. I just have no sense of who he really has with him. As I said, he claims to have all these people backing him. And on my last trip, I met a cabinet minister who was very critical of Mugabe, but of course off the record. And so he would be somebody that I would imagine is backing Makoni in this. But until we really see who's going to come out, I think it's very difficult to see him making a huge impact. I mean, maybe he left it too late to, and the way that he, initially denied for ages that he was going to stand, and then suddenly made this surprise announcement that he was going to, was all quite odd, I thought.
Gugu, what do you think? Is Simba a real factor?
A lot of the coverage has focused on Simba Makoni's personal attributes. I don't think that is it. I think what is important about Simba Makoni is what he represents. He did it about announcing what he was going to do, but I think that had a lot to do with what was going on in the mediation and within the MDC. Because Simba Makoni does have support from a group of people within ZANU-PF who stopped Mugabe from extending his term of office to 2010. I think it's quite clear that he has support from that group. They also had hoped something would come out of the mediation, that Mugabe would somehow agree to retire. And when they realized he didn't, they then decided to do something further. And of course, they waited to see what the opposition would do. If the opposition would unite, there wouldn't have been a need, or at least they wouldn't have had much of a chance of defeating the opposition. Yeah. And only after they had looked at all that did Simba Makoni decide to go into it. Also, he has the backing of some very influential people within business. He's one of them. He goes to the World Economic Forum and talks, and they trust him. They also have a lot of money to put behind him. And there has been a lot of work that has been done behind the scenes, particularly by people in business, trying to put together a sort of reform program for Zimbabwe, economic reform primarily, but social reforms and so on. And they have the support of Thabo Mbeki, for instance, and or at least that's what I'm made to understand. And they've been talking to key figures within the World Bank and so on. So there is a project there. But no one quite knows what this ZANU-PF reform project really is and what it means. Yeah. And I think this is the difficult part. And all those who are involved will not play their hand until very late in the game because of Mugabe's capacity to destroy those who oppose him. So, Zimbabwean voters are going into this in a really difficult way because no one knows what that project really is. And if you listen to what Simba Makoni has said, he's pretty vague about what he stands for, but he's been very clear that, he's ZANU-PF, 100% ZANU-PF. Yeah. So, I think that he is very significant in the sense that he exposes the divisions within ZANU-PF. It's quite clear, for a long time, there've been all sorts of, there's been all sorts of positioning taking place within ZANU-PF. But now I think, the mask has fallen off. It's quite clear that ZANU-PF is divided, and it's a weakened party, and that is important.
Right. What do you think, Tererai? Has he got any sort of organisation behind him to make a difference?
I don't think so. Personally, I'm very... the whole situation, we're 29 days from an election. 29 days. And if we don't know who those people are and they haven't come out and cannot come out and say who they are and why they support him, then as far as I'm concerned, they don't exist. 29 days before an election. If they exist, then they are so fearful of what Mugabe might do should the situation not go well. Because I think Zimbabweans deserve more than that. They deserve more than a guy coming out just a couple of weeks before an election. No one knows what his platform is. He was asked on the BBC this morning, what program would you put in place to turn around the economy? And I think his answer was, I'm not going to discuss these micro issues. and the presenter was kind of shocked at this response. He said, but Zimbabweans who don't know where their next meal is coming from, which is a fact, would want to know what you would do. And he says, I don't have a crystal ball to tell you where their next meal would come from. These answers to me were just, it's that same disregard for Zimbabweans. And I think that that's what a lot of African politics usually does. The people who vote people into power always get disregarded. And again, it was Moletin Mbeki who said this week that there are always these elitists who forget what the plight of the common man is. So you get people like Mugabe start saying people from Bari are people who don't have totems and they don't have rural homes, but these are people that, they're your people, supposedly. If you go into politics, I think there should be a reason and an agenda. And I think Makoni, if he can't say who these people are, he needs to drop out. If you can't answer a question like, what's your program to turn around the economy, you don't deserve to be running the country, and you shouldn't. He has no political party, no structures whatsoever. So if he becomes president, by some miracle gets voted into power, what structures would he... He can't even organize a rally in his own Makoni village because there are no structures there. We don't know what the name of his political party is. Does anyone here know? So who would you... We're voting for Simba Makoni of what party? Who's going to do what? We don't have a platform. I don't know. I'm very skeptical about the whole thing. I think it's one of those things where intellectually he looks good. He's worked for SADC. He would make for a good sort of go-between the moderates within ZANU-PF and those within the opposition who are disillusioned with the MTC, and he could sort of bring those two elements together. But I think to the common man on the ground, doesn't mean a thing.
Gugu, do you want to come in on this?
Well, yeah, what Tererai says sort of assumes or implies that Zimbabwe would have a democratic election and then people would, their vote would count for something. But I don't think that people's votes will count for much. So it matters what happens in ZANU-PF because they're the people who get to decide what happens. All this stuff about, what he intends to do and so on. Yeah, he's not going to say because it doesn't really decide this election. So I do think that you have to bear in mind that this isn't. It's quite clear you're not going to have a free and fair election. So what matters really is what is happening, particularly in ZANU-PF.
Could we tease it out a little bit, though? I mean, how much can Robert Mugabe rig the election? If 90% of the voters voted against him, could he rig it that much to overturn that? Is there a limit at which you can't fix the result?
I think there is a limit. I think the way in which the election is rigged is very sophisticated. It's not sort of crude stuffing of ballots. You have, for instance, the media environment. For years, people have been subjected to propaganda, and the opposition doesn't get any positive coverage at all. Mugabe gets all the coverage and a saturation coverage of ZANU-PF. As I said, as far as the media is concerned, at least the state-controlled media, Mugabe is in the lead, or ZANU-PF is already leading. And then you have all these institutions, the Electoral Commission itself and so on, appointed by Mugabe, ZANU-PF. You have traditional leaders who on the ground are saying to people, we know who you're going to vote for, and vote for ZANU-PF. And then you have, the whole system of patronage and control of resources. People know that, if you don't vote for ZANU-PF, you will suffer as a consequence of that. So, in fact, it's quite sensible for them to vote for ZANU-PF, because if you don't vote for ZANU-PF, you won't get food. And if you're starving, that really matters. That decides how you're going to vote. I think that a lot of people do vote for ZANU-PF, but for various reasons. But in the sense of, how much can he rig an election? Not very much. It will be more difficult to rig, and also because there are a number of things that have changed this time. There are new arrangements for counting. They'll have to count votes at constituencies and then announce them at polling stations. The army, at least on paper, has been excluded from the sort of organizing the administration of elections. That's an important change. So there are a number of new sort of arrangements which will make it more difficult to change, to rig the election.
Mugabe's very clever. I remember at the last elections he had one of the few concessions he'd agreed with SADC was that there would be transparent voting boxes. Yeah. And then he immediately used that by, in the villages, people were told, we can see how you're voting. So,
just one other point on these elections. I mean, we all know they're not going to be anywhere near free and fair. And as Gugu said, it's very sophisticated rigging that he's done this time. But let's not also forget that these are people who ignore decisions by the highest courts in the land. The Supreme Court can say one thing, the High Court can say one thing, and they just proceed to do what they want. So he could pull a Kenya. I mean, results can come and show that he's lost by whatever, and maybe they will announce something different. We don't know what he's going to do exactly, but we do know that he has put some very sophisticated mechanisms in place. The MDC has said they're participating because they want to document, should he rig and should it be proven that he's rigged. They want to have documentation of this, because this is what they believe got Mugabe isolated the first time, when it was proven that he had rigged an election. But people get assaulted and beaten and killed on the way to elections in Zimbabwe. And I think that if we all know that it's not going to be free and fair, then we're playing this game where, there's some other agenda. But, there are people who do suffer every time there's elections in Zimbabwe. I mean, as it is, the month of February alone, I can't tell you how many reports I've done with people on the other end of the phone who are bleeding. Yesterday, Pisham Chaurai was attacked by 48 people at a growth point where there are shops, simply because they were wearing MDC T-shirts on their way to a meeting. ZANU-PF is still arresting people for having private meetings in a private home where they were discussing their polling agents and their election strategies. So, it just feels like this silly game we play over and over and over and over. And I'd rather, really personally, I think, if they're boycotted, get out of parliament because nothing's happening there. ZANU-PF is the majority. Everything you do is overridden by ZANU-PF. ZANU-PF would have had that country to themselves, which is what they really are doing anyway, but we're sort of playing this game with them. I think if the opposition had left parliament a long time ago, give them the country if they want it. The economy is unmanageable. He would have been isolated a lot more than he is now, and then focus your energies on other things. Because ZANU-PF is going to do what they want. It sounds radical, but I think it's time to try a different strategy.
Let me take one more question, and then we'll open it up, I think, for everyone to...
I would just say, I agree with Gugu that the only way things are going to change in the current situation is from within ZANU-PF. I don't see any change coming from outside. But I wonder, I mean, Simba Makoni is seen so much, or is so much a favoured candidate of the West, that, and they've been lobbying him for a long while to do this, that surely that's going to work against him. Mugabe is going to use that.
He is doing that, but you know, this again, I mean, Zimbabwe is so difficult to try and sort of describe and explain right now. But you know, that depends on how much support Simba Makoni has within ZANU-PF, and it's quite clear that he has support within ZANU-PF. So the people Mugabe is speaking to are the same people, or some of them will be supporting Simba Makoni and quietly campaigning for him. And it's not, you know, I'm not saying that Simba Makoni will win the election or that he can win, but I think that it will certainly make things very difficult for Mugabe, particularly after the election. He'll be in a very weakened position, and it means that they might be able to move him out within ZANU-PF. And the thing is that nothing will change before Mugabe goes. So I think that's an important first step that must happen, however it happens.
Okay, quick point, and then we'll let some questions.
Yeah, just I don't see really how Simba Makoni, you know, for example, the MDC when it split, we made noise about this other formation now, Professor Atham Tambara. I've yet to see a rally where there were thousands of people at a rally by that formation. I think some of these parties exist only in these internet chat rooms, websites that we all put out, and on the ground, a lot of these people don't have a lot of support. So we make them out to be these powerful entities that really make no difference. We keep talking about this support that Makoni has from within ZANU-PF, this split within ZANU-PF. I always had the Mnangagwa faction. I watched Emerson Mnangagwa standing next to Superman Nwanzira at the ZANU-PF Congress this year, just a couple of months ago. Emerson Mnangagwa, who supposedly leads a faction that's trying to remove Mugabe, he stood there and he said, no, we only have one president, and it's Robert Mugabe. And I remember this clearly. So until these people come out and say who they are, until they get over their fear of Mugabe, and until that, you know, they show they've got some balls, which we need to start showing, because Mugabe has them. As much as I dislike the guy, he's got balls. He does what he says, and he sticks to his word. Opposition said we will never go to an election without a new constitution. Are we going to an election without one? Yes, we are. They said we would never go to an election without those things that Thabo Mbeki promised us. If they're not implemented, we won't go. They're going without him. Then Mugabe bamboozled them into signing Amendment 18. I'm sorry, that was a dumb move. And we've been holding them in an eggshell because they had the only viable chance of removing Robert Mugabe. So everyone tiptoed around MDC for a long time because they had the only chance to remove an evil. It was the lesser of a really terrible situation. But I think it's time now, because I think Christina even said it, that they don't need Makoni to split the opposition. They've been blundering around themselves. And if they're going to keep making mistakes, like signing an amendment to the Constitution while demanding a new Constitution, what sense was that? And it gave Mugabe, by the way, the power. This is what harmonized these elections. It gave Mugabe the power to appoint a successor through Parliament, that same amendment. And they went around signing it because Thabo Mbeki said, if we sign this, Mugabe will give us some concessions. Mugabe turned around and said to them and Mbeki, out. Mbeki ran around from State House. This happened. I'm not making it up. Mbeki left South Africa. It's not that Mugabe went to South Africa. You know where the power base lies. Mbeki left South Africa, went to Harare, ran around from State House to his ambassadors, to the High Commissioner's house. Well, Mugabe won't do this. Can we do this? They give him an answer. He runs back to Mugabe. They got him running back and forth. So who was running who? Was Mugabe running Mbeki or Mbeki running Mugabe? Mugabe refused all 3 options Becky gave him. Becky went back to South Africa and tried to say that he had succeeded. On what?
Okay, let's have a couple of questions from the floor. There's one very keen person here and one at the front.
Hello, just an interested party. I was hoping that the panel could comment on the international community's role on a political level as well as a business level, and also from the Western perspective as well as the Chinese.
Okay, thank you. And this gentleman in the front.
Yeah, my name is Itai. I'm from the Zimbabwe Guardian. I wanted to just make a quick comment that there seems to be an overemphasis put on ZANU-PF rather than on actually strengthening the opposition. As we know, ZANU-PF has had divisions since its formation in 1963. But as a party, they've managed to maintain those divisions and go into power. And my concern is a lot of people look at the MDC and then try to think that MDC will go into power simply because ZANU-PF has had divisions. We've seen divisions in ZANU-PF for a very long time, and they've managed to maintain some homogeneity even with those supposed divisions. And also, the weaknesses within the MDC have to be looked at. The MDC has sort of rang its own death now, to be honest, with the divisions, with the mixed messages they're bringing. At the moment, Morgan Tsvangirai is busy campaigning in the urban areas. We know he's got a lot of support within the urban areas. So he should really concentrate in where he doesn't have support. Whether he's trying to make himself feel good about having support or trying to re-influence the people to vote for him, we're not sure.
Do you have a specific question for any of these?
Yeah, I just wanted to know what the panel thinks of the strategy of the MDC in relation to ZANU-PF, and also just with regards to the role of the what Mugabe always says, the international scene is trying to bring regime change to Zimbabwe. So I wanted to know what the panel thinks about.
Okay, we'll take those two and then have another pair of questions. Anybody want to tackle either of those two?
Well, with the international community, and one of the things that makes me mad about Zimbabwe is the way that international agencies, particularly UN agencies, accept the conditions under which they work in Zimbabwe. And I would have liked very much to have seen, particularly UN agencies, to have actually stood up and said, we won't, if we can't operate properly in this country, then we're not going to operate at all, and be thrown out. And that would have been focused much more attention. I've had long arguments with people from UN agencies over this, because of course they say it's better that we're helping a few people, and you know, what do you expect us to abandon everybody? But frankly, this has been going on for so many years that how many people have died of starvation over those years, we just don't know. And I think it would have been much better to have taken a stance, and I find it very frustrating that they don't.
Even though we give food aid to North Korea and other countries that arguably are worse?
Well, that's a whole subject of a debate, I think, here. But I just feel that people have too much accepted what Mugabe imposes on them. And even after the Marambas-Fina operation, the UN, in agreement with Mugabe, built a community for people to be moved to who had all their homes destroyed, and that was all agreed, and they built this place. And then Mugabe's people went in and demolished that, and the UN said nothing, and they publicly tried to pretend it had never happened because it was so embarrassing. But if they're just going to be kicked around like that and allow their food aid to be used for electoral purposes, which is what has been happening, I think is really shocking. Has helped sustain him in power.
Yeah, no, I'm with Christina on this one, where I think too many international agencies accept the situation as it is. The World Food Programme being one of the ones that really upset me the most. I remember speaking to them, the headquarters in South Africa, and I was telling them about a particular incident where food was being used for political purposes, and I was giving them facts and names and things like that, because I thought they should know because they had donated this food. And he just basically said to me, we'd rather feed those few ZANU-PF people that wind up getting it rather than not feed anyone at all in the rural areas. And I thought that was a rather really sick answer to give. And I think sometimes they should put their foot down. Another thing that upsets me is that there's very little known fact, but the UN also pays for a lot of events that involves ZANU-PF and the opposition. And I remember once, I forget which holiday it was, but it was paid for. There was a celebration in Kwadzana or one of these high-density areas that was paid for by the UN, and ZANU-PF actually did not invite the opposition. It was an international day of something or rather, paid for by the UN. And they were celebrating within the rubble of Operation Murambatsvina. I mean, the houses that had been destroyed not long ago. UN pays for a party, ZANU-PF is partying there, and MDC is not invited. I think sometimes that money is just wasted. And also they are given conditions. You can't bring in food to Zim and just distribute. Everything has to go through government channels, and they know that it's politicized in the end if ZANU-PF has a hand in it. China, I think someone asked about China. China's being allowed to get away with so much in Africa. If you ever wanted evidence that, cash rules, business runs everything, China is the greatest example. I mean, remember the whole incident where first it was Bill Gates, who used to be one of my heroes. China insisted that he remove certain words from their browser that had to do with democracy. And because, a billion Chinamen equals a billion computers sold, Bill Gates removed that language from their browser. And that was very disappointing. The British signed many contracts with the Chinese last year, banks, insurance, etc. In Africa, the Chinese are taking all the resources they need to feed their machinery and feeding dictators. They're in Darfur, in the Sudan, they're in Zimbabwe. They've flooded the place with their cheap products. I mean, everyone knows the whole Xinjiang joke in Zimbabwe where their products are called Xinjiangs. They fall apart and they don't care who they do business with. But it's not just Africa that's letting China get away with all of this. I mean, a lot of countries. America has done it. It's business, and money rules. And, unfortunately, if Iraq or Iran or any of these places had to do with democracy, if the reasons that certain countries invaded had to do with democracy, then they would be in Zimbabwe as well. But I guess if we had oil, they would have been there as well.
Gugu, do you want to tackle either question, maybe the MDC strategy one?
Okay. The international community first. I think, with the humanitarian issues, I think it's very difficult. I certainly find it very difficult to argue that, the UN or other NGOs should pull out and not give food aid because, people will die, people are dying, and the work that they're doing there is helpful. And ZANU-PF has been quite clear that they do not care what happens to people as long as they stay in power. I think Didymus Mutasa said, we'd be happy to remain with 6 million as long as they support us. So I think that these agencies should stay in there, and there's a limit to what the United Nations can do because the members of the United Nations are divided about Zimbabwe, and that is where the problem is. So you have the West wanting to do something and being very strong about it, and Africa and some of the other developing world leaders in fact supporting, saying, we don't want to be told what to do, particularly Africa, we don't want to be told what to do about Zimbabwe. Having said that, I think Africa, SADC particularly, is now under more pressure to do something about Zimbabwe. It's quite clear that there is an attempt to save Zimbabwe. Namibia and Angola have been trying to at least lend Zimbabwe money to continue to supply electricity in a very small way. It just shows you how bankrupt the Zimbabwean government is. I think they loaned Zimbabwe something like $12 million US in order just to get a bit of power into Zimbabwe. So the situation is very desperate. And I do think I appreciate the arguments of those who say, well, if you let Zimbabwe's economy slide any further, trying to rebuild it will be a very expensive task and it will take much longer. So trying to save what is there is important, and I think this is the tragedy of Zimbabwe, in fact, that people have suffered so much they can't do anything for themselves. So in a way, it's important to try and strengthen those people who are there, particularly just with food. People are leaving Zimbabwe, they're crossing into Zimbabwe, so there'll be no one to vote, and so it's important to support those who stay there. And I think the international community, particularly Western governments, have done a lot to support pro-democracy forces. A lot of money has gone into that. So besides food aid, there is a lot of money going into NGOs who are campaigning for democracy and to support the opposition, I think. But having said that, I think SADC has prepared the world for Mugabe victory. Mwanamasa said recently, the world will only accept an election in Zimbabwe as free and fair if Mugabe loses. So I think they can see that this is coming. They can see that they've failed, and they're preparing the world to accept another Mugabe victory. But I think they also are under immense pressure, and this is where the role of the international community comes in. And again, also, I think the international opportunity has an opportunity to exploit these divisions within ZANU-PF, because it's quite clear that there's some people, whether they're reformers or not, they certainly think that the situation ought to be rescued. They're suffering as well. They were making money, but now they're not making so much money, and they're not going to be able to turn the situation around without the help of the international community. Right. And this is where I think the international community comes into it, where whoever wins, we're going to have to work with them. At the end of the day, if Mugabe were to turn around now and say, I'm reforming and change a whole lot of things, I think I would be quite okay with that. And so what we have to accept is that something is going to happen, an election is going to take place, and somebody is going to be in power. Unfortunately, if it's Mugabe, nothing's going to change. So yes, by all means, don't support him. But if it's anybody else, I think the international community will then have the ability to press for further reforms. The return of the rule of law and a whole range of other important reforms. And so the international community, I think, should prepare for that. But before that, I think they should be applying pressure to SADC to ensure that this election is open. What Christina said about Pakistan. Yeah. It's possible, I think, for that election to be freer and fair if we shine some light on it. So if there's a bit more openness, if they press for monitoring of that election, proper monitoring, I think the possibilities are good, and the international community can do that. Yeah. The MDC, that's
nice, quick, easy.
that is a really difficult one. The MDC has I think really disappointed very many people, and I think this is what makes Zimbabwe very difficult. A few years ago, well, the people who are now writing about Simba Makoni and advocating for his candidacy are people who a few years ago would not have dared entertain any ZANU-PF candidate, coming on the scene and saying, here I am to save you. But the fact that people are even thinking of Makoni and knowing that people like Mujura are backing him, it tells you that people are desperate. The MDC has really disappointed. People were hoping that the MDC would unite, but they didn't. And my understanding is it's about jobs. They all want to get into parliament, so none of them are willing to give up, their positions. At the same time, of course, they have suffered a great deal of persecution, and that weakened them. And so I do feel sorry for them, but unfortunately that isn't enough. And I also understand and support their approach that they will try for non-violent change, and so I respect that. But unfortunately, I think that really. The problem was within the MDC. They should have seen beyond these sort of narrow goals and united. They should have done that.
Let's have another round of questions. There was a gentleman, I think you wanted a question at the front, and then we'll take 2 or 3 more over here.
Yes, actually, I've got two questions. One is that...
Could you identify yourself?
Okay, my name is Karimakweda. One is that with the prospects of a Mugabe victory, I mean, people in Zimbabwe face another bleak and hopeless 5 years unless someone can pull something out of them. So my question really is that, so, you know, the members of the panel see that things basically continue, you know, basically people lobbying, the international community lobbying, the MDC hoping for some change of heart with ZANU-PF, or is it time for people to, well, let's say take a Kenya solution, go out on the street and try and do their own, find their own solutions, let's put it like that.
Okay.
That's my first thing. The second one is that I mean, from the you know, the election in Kenya which Moyo lost, that had a lot to do with the division within KANU itself, splitting and allowing some KANU people to cross over to the opposition, and that's what allowed Moyo to come in. And you know, listening to everything that has been said, even though it's this late stage, if there is genuine support for Makoni within ZANU-PF, you know, there is still potential for them to kind of walk out on the party and support Makoni, which even if after the election, even though Makoni doesn't have a party because he's been ejected, he will effectively be the leader of the ZANU if the opposition within ZANU move with him, so to speak.
Okay, thank you. There was a gentleman over there who was very keen.
My name is Richard Brown. I visited Zimbabwe in 1992 and 2004, and this is related to the condition of the industry and infrastructure. I noticed a huge deterioration in those 12 years. And I just wondered whether you think that if Mugabe does leave office, that a huge international reconstruction effort will be necessary, or will it be more of a relief effort, which is probably not sustainable?
Okay, thank you. We'll lady at the front here, and then the gentleman at the back, and then we'll go to the panel.
My name is Moyo. The first question is to Tererai. You seem to be very pessimistic about Simba Makoni. In fact, you really are not so convinced that he can really make any difference in Zimbabwe politics. But in a way, for so many people, it seems like that's the one solution to actually help the situation where MDC has not been able to deliver to the promises or help the people of Zimbabwe. That's one question. And the second one is, maybe to the panel, why is it that Mugabe is so feared, even by the people within the party itself, I mean, the ZANU-PF itself? And the final one is about the business, sorry.
Yes.
Is about the international business community. We understand, or I'm made to understand, that there are so many business companies there who are just sitting and waiting for the time that Mugabe leaves, and then they just sort of pounce on Zimbabwe because it has so much to offer. Do you think the reason why Mugabe has kept to his word of not wanting to leave the government has anything to do with the fact that he knows that the international community does need him? Or?
Okay, one last question for this round, gentleman on the back row.
I'm Derek Smann. I started the Daily News in Zimbabwe, and we will be back this year after the election. I want to make a few observations and one question.
Okay.
The observation is, one, everyone in this room, if they could do something for Zimbabwe, and we said do 10 press-ups, they'd do 20 and kill themselves to make a difference. The fact is, no one in this room has one chance at all to vote in the election. The election is not going to be decided in this room. So one of the issues is the Makoni is sort of the voice of the chattering classes, the self-interested businessmen who've made a lot of money out of ZANU-PF, who are now coming out or not coming out, and the worry is, the fact is Shanghai has more votes in previous elections legitimately, but fraudulently gained against him. I think the difference now is the Makoni factor. The fact is, the first time we have 3 candidates, 2 of them within ZANU-PF, from whichever wing, and the president will only be elected provided they have a 51% vote. I think the most interesting thing is, what do the panel think about the chances of an outright winner in the first round, because I don't believe there will be one, and how do they see it breaking down between the 3 candidates thereafter?
Okay, thank you. Maybe choose a question or two that you want to tackle.
There's a lot of questions there. I mean, the first question about whether, because it all looks so bleak, whether it's time that people take to the streets. I mean, it is incredibly bleak. There is no, I cover awful stories in other countries, Pakistan, Afghanistan, other places. There is nowhere that I find as heartbreaking as Zimbabwe, because every time I go back, the situation has just got worse. And there doesn't seem any hope, and you think it can't get any worse than this. So last time I was there, I was in all these supermarkets where there was just nothing on any of the shelves, and people just standing around. And people with no electricity having to go and forage for firewood, and the country just really going backwards, and yet it just still continues. And you've seen from other countries such as DRC that things can just keep deteriorating for many years. And Zimbabwe, in some ways, still has a long way to go. I used to get very frustrated when I went to Zimbabwe, because I would be saying to people, why don't you do something about it yourself? Why don't you go out into the streets? Why don't you try and bring down this government? And couldn't understand why people didn't do that, despite having interviewed lots of people who'd been horribly tortured and actually seen the evidence of Mugabe's repression. But what really made me change was during Operation Round Botswana, seeing how people just had their homes bulldozed by these policemen and ZANU-PF thugs, and just did absolutely nothing. And I watched in Mbari, in the biggest township of Harare, just people sit there and see everything that they had ever worked for be destroyed. And I just can't imagine having my home, not just my home, but people lost everything that they worked for, beauty salons that they'd built, carpenters' workshops. Those people weren't criminals or beggars. They mostly were people earning a decent living, and they'd lost everything. And yet nobody stood up and protested. And not only that, but people actually helped the police in throwing their belongings on the fire when they were told to. And that made me think people are never going to come onto the streets. They are so totally repressed by Mugabe. So I just don't see that happening, and that's why it is almost desperation to look at Makoni now as a hope, because you feel that the MDC have not been able to do anything. People are not going to come out onto the streets. So the only hope for change is from within the ruling party.
Gugu, do you want to tackle one or two of those questions?
Yeah, you know, people going out on the street, I don't think that's going to happen for the reasons that I said earlier. You know, people are hungry, people are tired, they've been intimidated for years, they're worn down by all of this. They spend their time trying to find food, you know, and that's serious business. And then when you're ill, you know, I was in Zimbabwe in November. You basic things, when people become ill, you provide your own drip at the hospital, you get a prescription, you can't get medication, and so on. There's a problem with HIV and AIDS, you know, people are going to funerals all the time, you know, all these things are very difficult. And when I went to Zimbabwe, people weren't going to vote. Now when I speak to people, some of them are going to vote, so that's progress, and that is because they felt in the past that the election wouldn't make a difference. With Simba Makoni having come out, they think that things are different. And again, it's difficult to tell what people mean by it's different. They're not necessarily saying they're going to go out and vote for Simba Makoni, but as Derek said, you know, that there is a chance the MDC this time might get more votes. But the MDC is also deeply divided. And, Tererai is not in the position that he was in last time around. So and it's difficult to tell what impact that those divisions will have, at the election. It's quite clear, for instance, that in Matabeleland, he might have lost quite a bit of support. He's trying to regain that, and I think he's sort of one of the things that he said might have an unfortunate impact. He's put Gugulethu top of his agenda. Now I think that's a cynical, perhaps, attempt to exploit that issue and to get the Matabeleland vote, because of course Matabeleland is an issue, but I don't think it's necessarily top of the agenda for this particular election. But because he's lost a lot of support in Matabeleland, he has raised this to the agenda. But I don't know what that will mean for ZANU-PF, because remember that, and we haven't said a lot about that, you still have a very powerful, strong state in Zimbabwe. The military, is very well equipped and willing to use that force, to suppress dissent. And I think that if they feel and if the strong statements, well, when we get into power, we will deal with you. I don't know how they will react to that. But also, the military isn't a monolith, so there are people within the military who support the MDC. It's very difficult to tell, what will happen within with the election. But you certainly can't write the MDC off. But it's quite clear that there will be this election will be a battle between the two MDCs and the two ZANU-PFs, or the many ZANU-PFs and ZANU-PF and the MDC. So it's difficult to tell what that means.
What about this question from the front of even the powerful people within ZANU-PF fear Mugabe? What are they fearing in particular? You can understand how an ordinary Zimbabwean on the street is fearing his house is demolished or he's can be beaten up by the secret police, but are even the powerful fearing Mugabe?
Yeah, they fear the same. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, Mugabe's sort of 4 or so decades of dominance in ZANU-PF is sort of littered with, dead bodies, metaphorical and real. Many of them. Mugabe is a very skilled politician, and he has been able to eliminate his opponents in various ways. And he has, in many ways, been able to defend ZANU-PF's position in the West. He's very strong as a leader in ZANU-PF, and those who are around him know that, if things, which is why they're not willing to show their hand, if they get it wrong and they can't push him out, he will not, hesitate to do away with them or at least destroy them. So I think they have a lot to fear, certainly from what has happened before.
Most of them owe everything to him as well.
Yeah.
They've benefited largely. I mean, I think there's a danger of focusing too much on Mugabe. I'm not sure that Mugabe going is the end of Zimbabwe's problems. I think
of course
to me it's like a mafia running the country.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, there are people that surround him that have benefited this entire time, and it's not just him alone. Otherwise, they would have taken him out a long time ago. There is a club of certain people that even after Mugabe goes, they may continue. ZANU-PF is a party with a philosophy and structures and a method of doing things, and who's to say that they won't continue that after Mugabe is gone? Why do they fear him? I think it's quite clear. Mugabe doesn't hesitate to it doesn't matter whether you're an ordinary Zimbabwean. We all saw what he did to Morgan Tsvangirai. I mean, the guy didn't even commit a crime, They just snatched him off the streets, beat him silly in a police station, then paraded him in front of the global media. An opposition leader. Now, we're not talking about, scars on the... Have you ever seen, like, an opposition leader? Can you imagine here, David Cameron or something, bleeding, torn shirt, being paraded in front... In any other context, these things would seem bizarre, but for some reason we've begun to accept them in Zimbabwe as though they're normal. But that's what Zimbabwe is. As they say, we've been ZANUized in a sense. And it's that culture of violence that ZANU-PF has created and developed there, and I think it will continue for a long time. So if he can do that to an opposition leader, and Gugu said there are people who Zimbabweans know who died in the past, and everyone sort of whispers around that Mugabe eliminated this one and eliminated that one. So it's known. That's why they fear him. And that's why they won't come out and say we support Makoni or this one or that one. By the way, I also want to just quickly say the MDC, as much as I've said that they've made a lot of mistakes and blunders, I've got to give them a lot of credit. Would you mind, please? Because they've been brutalized for a long period of time. And if you can manage to stay like that in Zimbabwe, you know, where just having a meeting or just doing normal things that anyone would be doing in an election, you're arrested, beaten. I mean, to be able to keep a party together like that and have followers, I got to give them a lot of credit. I don't think a lot of people would have held in there under that much pressure. So, you know, we are saying a lot of very negative things about some of the decisions they have made, but I got to give them a lot of credit because Mugabe has really, really thrown everything but the kitchen sink at them, and they've remained in there. They still have structures that are strong. I mean, their launch in Sakuva was well attended. If anyone has seen pictures of that, there were a lot of people there. They were a very organized team. They were all wearing the same T-shirts. They put out their election manifesto, painted a picture of what they're going to try to do when they go into power. It's the only opposition party I've seen do that. If you really want to look at who has got power, it's the only opposition party I've seen have thousands of people at a rally, and they've put out an organized picture of what they want to do. Now, Langton Tongana, who is that? I mean, there are people here who probably haven't even heard of his name, but he's a presidential candidate. And this is how ridiculous this thing is. People just rent hotel rooms, invite the press, and say, I'm running. Then I might as well go home and run myself.
What about this possibility of there not being an outright winner? Is there?
Yeah. You know, I think there is a real big possibility of that. And of course, then you would have to have a runoff between the two leading candidates. And this is where I think it would matter. You know, the way I see it, it would probably be you know, Mugabe first, Tererai second, and Makoni last. You know, and then it depends on what Makoni decides to do. You know, whether they pull that vote, or at least behind the opposition, which I think they might do. But it's really, you know, difficult, I think, to predict that. But certainly, you know, there's a possibility that there will have to be a runoff.
And the question about reconstruction, is there any, if we can think that far ahead, do you think there's a relief effort that's first, or is there an effort to, if the day comes in Zimbabwe that there's reconstruction, is it a huge task to reconstruct the infrastructure?
It's quite huge. I mean, it always takes much more to rebuild than it does to destroy. And I think that if you look at what's been destroyed, I mean, the place is falling apart. I've gone for days without being able to reach certain people because they couldn't charge their mobile phone because they didn't have electricity for a while. People are stealing the cables that are used. I mean, you know, people on the inside, people who work for the Electricity Supply Authority, because they have the tools that can remove the cables easily. And the potholes, the environment, I mean, it's just, you know, there's no fuel. People are cutting down trees so they can have some firewood. I mean, the place is a mess. It's going to take a long time, but hey, the sooner we start, the quicker we get there. I mean, it's never a hindrance. But I think we can't really go that much further. I mean, you know, the level of suffering I just think has reached at ridiculous levels. I mean, when we start talking about a pound is 20-something million Zim dollars, it's like equal 1 pound. It's just ridiculous, and I think we need to start reversing. And especially since it's just one man and one party that are keeping this.
Do we have time? We have another round of questions.
Just a comment about the reconstruction effort. I think there is a lot of work being done already. You know, there are various groups who have been working on you know, the reconstruction program. Western governments are very involved in that. You know, donor governments and the business community. You know, there are lots of programs in place. And I think it certainly from the investor perspective, it seems that there still is a lot to save in Zimbabwe. Merrill Lynch did a report on Africa last year, and they had a list of something like 50 companies to watch, and something like 10 of those were in Zimbabwe. So there's certainly something still going on there, and I think this is why there's a big battle. Of course, there would have to be a relief effort, first. But what you really need is stability and the return of the rule of law. Before that, Zimbabwe isn't going anywhere.
Okay, we can have 3 questions, so we'll take 2 from this side and 1 from that side. 2 ladies here at the front, in the middle.
I'm from the University of Kent. I have a question about SADC and South Africa. I mean, in 2005, there was South African election observers. I think they touched down on the tarmac. They touched down on the tarmac of Harare Airport and already said it was a free and fair election. What do you think has changed this time to make? You said there was more pressure on SADC this time, more pressure on South Africa. What's actually changed? Because I don't really see that there's that much difference now. Will the same thing happen again?
Thank you. Just in front of you, if you want to.
Hi, my name is Rose Davis. I just wanted to ask the panel, we were talking earlier about people coming onto the streets and so on. In Zimbabwe 2 weeks ago, there was something called the People's Convention. 4,000 people gathered in Harare. I wondered if you were aware of it, whether people are reporting on it. I haven't seen much reporting, and I think that's quite significant. It was representatives of civic society groups who are just completely fed up, who are very disillusioned with the MDC apart from anything else. There was an attempt at that convention to get everybody to say they were going to back Morgan van der Weyden, and they wouldn't. I just wondered whether the panel was aware of that, and to sort of just point out that actually, although people are very, very tired in Zimbabwe, there is still a lot of resistance. Waza Women of Zimbabwe Arise is one of the groups that is resisting hugely and have done quite a lot, and in fact they were probably sort of fed into even the calling of that People's Convention. They and other civic society people met with the South African delegation, and so there's just perhaps
okay, you just have time to deal with it. Yeah.
Civil society.
And the gentleman just here on the end of the road, just beside you.
I just wanted to invite the panel to comment a bit, because I think Tererai, you've dwelt quite a lot on in terms of like people staying within Zimbabwe and not coming out. And we know very well with the experiences of people like Corunelli, where the government arrests you and then charges you later, and a year later you're still in prison. But it was suggested to me actually yesterday that by people staying in within ZANU-PF and the dynamic where the factions are actually reflected in the army and the security apparatus as well, that actually breeds a culture of mistrust, and as such can actually go a long way in weakening the rigging system, which has been quite strong, because now it's no longer unified. So 2 agents sitting next to each other might actually not be sure, who is betting on each side. And then I wanted to tackle you, especially Tererai, because I read a post that was on your website, and you said Makoni unveils his vision. And what struck me quite starkly in terms of SW Radio's shortwave Radio Africa's approach, since you've come out right from the beginning quite anti-Makoni, because in your heading you actually had the vision of Makoni in quotation marks. And I just wondered, even if it was flawed, what was the basis for actually quoting it in quotation marks, for instance? I just wondered whether that was reflected in quite your strong stance against Makoni.
Thank you very much. Tererai, do you want to start off?
First, yeah. I think the first question was about SADC and the pressure on SADC and what's changed this time. I really don't see anything different this time. I mean, Mugabe has said he's inviting only friendly nations to monitor this election and be observers. I don't see any pressure that's on SADC, and who's putting any pressure? I don't see any pressure at all that's being brought to bear on SADC. They tried this initiative with Thabo Mbeki, it failed, and that's that. It's finished, it's over. There's been no word from anyone else at SADC except from Mbeki saying that it succeeded. So I don't have any faith in that. I think Mbeki's brother was correct last week in the press in South Africa when he said that SADC fears the emergence of parties like the MDC in Zimbabwe. He said the MDC was the first party to come out of SADC that wants to hold governments accountable and get the ordinary people involved in issues of governance, etc. And that SADC leaders fear that, because if parties like the MDC become spread out in the region, then they too will be held accountable, meaning the other SADC leaders. So I don't see any pressure being brought to bear. In fact, this is why they're quiet on Mugabe, and this is why I think they support him. The People's Convention, yeah, I was aware of it. In fact, I covered it personally. The women of Zimbabwe Arise Waza, which you talk about, they were beaten at that convention. I think they went into the Africa Unity Square Park or something, and they had their Waza scarves, and police just kind of dragged them out for a while, and they were assaulted in custody, I believe, on that occasion. In fact, I think they spent the weekend with cushions on their asses because they were, they like doing that, so you can't sit down. But that convention, yeah, they did fail to come up with a consensus. I mean, with a single candidate rather, because there were people who felt that Makoni might be given a chance. But again, I think that ZANU-PF does what ZANU-PF wants. They haven't changed their spots, and this election is going to go the way that ZANU-PF wants it. The Makoni story you're talking about, I think that was done by Lance Guma. I think you took it literally, the quotes. It wasn't his vision in terms of us putting, that's what he had called it, and I think Lance quoted him in the headline, or he intended to do that.
Sorry, hold on.
No, I was just saying it was specifically quoted. It was like a headline and say vision, as if like, well, is it a vision or? I think it reflects what your editorial live has been, and I just wondered if it was reflected in the way you feel quite strongly, and I was just interested.
I've tried to be very fair about Makoni. To be honest, if I were to really present my personal thoughts, I would have been more brutal than I have been. No, seriously, I've tried to be fair. I've literally presented what he has said. The things that I quoted, he did say that in the BBC interview. I could have gone worse. When he announced his candidacy, in Harare, I think I recorded him on, he was broadcast on ZBC. Now, if I were to tell you how ridiculous some of the things he said there, and I avoided doing that. I just pretty much talked about the BBC interview because that was this morning, or, that was the most recent. But, when you come out with statements like, land is not an ornament for beautification, it is he said that, by the way. Beautification, land, ornament, what? It was like, I just don't get the guy. I thought he was very bright, excuse me. I was expecting a lot from him. But I think he's made a move that, it just doesn't seem well thought out and organized. Remember, we asked him a month before that when rumors started spreading that he was running, and he said he was not going to run for president. Then we found out he had a 2-hour meeting with Mugabe that week. Came out of that meeting, the next week he's announcing that he's running. So, I don't know, did Mugabe in that meeting tell him, you're going to do it and split the opposition, or for whatever reason? Did Mugabe say, you better not run, and he ran anyway because he's brave? We don't know. But what we do know is what we know is that no one has come out on his side.
Okay, Gugu, do you have a last round-up on those questions for you?
What's changed in SADC? SADC is a complex organization. I think you have to look at the individual countries that are in SADC. The situation with elections in Africa and the response of the international community and the African community to elections, I think the international community particularly has been inconsistent in its responses to elections, and that hasn't helped the situation. They will recognize leaders who have been elected in a flawed way if it suits them, and then sometimes they'll be particularly critical. That's worked in Mugabe's favor. And I think Kenya has and has not helped. What would Kibaki say to Mugabe about elections? What would Yar'Adua from Nigeria say to Mugabe about elections? So I think the African leaders would have a difficulty, pressing Mugabe about free and fair elections. But at the same time, there are economic interests there. SADC as a region is growing, and Zimbabwe is really holding that growth and integration back. And so there are efforts really to save Zimbabwe, particularly on the economic side, and they realize that, without the rule of law, without Mugabe going, basically Zimbabwe won't move forward. So there is an effort to save Mugabe. And I think that, Thabo Mbeki really did try, but Mugabe is just the person he is. He went along, and he was quite clear as to what he was doing. When he saw that the opposition was weak, he said, of course, we'll call an election when our opposition is weak. That's what you do. You take advantage of your opponent's weaknesses. So, he has deliberately gone ahead with the election, and that has killed the negotiations. And I have sympathy for the MDC, because what could they do? They're divided, so they were weak, and they can't do much on the streets in Zimbabwe. So they had to go along with that process. And I think a lot has been achieved, and I think we shouldn't we should recognize that. Last time around, Mugabe could appoint 30 members of parliament, and he has used those. He used to at least use those 30 seats to make up the balance. In fact, in the 2000 election, the MDC was close to having a majority, and with some of the elections that were nullified, would probably have had a majority were it not for those 30 seats. So they've done away with that through the SADC process, and so that's achieved a lot. And all the other concessions, unfortunately, I think implementation is the problem. And the South African foreign minister has said, if the Zimbabwean government must implement, but how far they will go to ensure that that is implemented, I don't know. But certainly Mbeki is under pressure domestically to deal with Zimbabwe. There is a lot of unhappiness in South Africa. People are beating each other up in the townships in South Africa. Because there are many Zimbabweans coming in, and people who are unemployed think that Zimbabweans are taking their jobs, and it's not necessarily true, but this is what is happening in South Africa. COSATU, of course, supports the MDC, and given the changes within the ANC, there is pressure from them for Mbeki to deal with this. So it is a domestic issue for him. But having said that, South Africa is also absorbed with its own issues internally. So I don't know what all that means. Angola and Namibia support Mugabe, and Zambia, I think, also in a way support Mugabe. And I think the SADC project is a reform ZANU-PF, because part of it is about a peaceful transition. And I think that the concern is that, certainly from the SADC point of view, they believe that if it's not ZANU-PF, it won't be peaceful. So they're worried about a greater flow of refugees from Zimbabwe and so on. I think that they are under pressure to solve it. They must solve that problem. Mbeki has the World Cup to present, and then Zimbabwe must be solved before then, otherwise he will have a real problem on his hands. And China, just going back, because I remember that, China again it's interesting what has happened with Sudan. China is under a lot of pressure on human rights issues in Africa, and I think that that might affect also what they do in Zimbabwe. I don't think they will necessarily be supportive of the Zimbabwean government, or they will carry on with business and continue to make money. But I don't think that they will necessarily shore them up. The people who have been trying to step in have actually been the neighbors. Civil society is very important in Zimbabwe, and plays a very important part in international civil society. And then this is where we come in. I, for one, I think, given what has gone on, have become fairly realistic about Zimbabwe. I still am an idealist and would like a free and fair election, but I don't think that it's going to happen anytime soon. But what I think we can do is work with whatever we have, and it's, for me, it's a bit like the difference between convicts. You have on the extreme end Mugabe, who sort of really deserves life without parole. And then you have the other players who perhaps, one is a first offender, and that's probably the MDC, because there are serious flaws within the MDC, but there's capacity for reform. And then this reform ZANU-PF, which might be a more difficult reform project, but there are possibilities there, and I think that we have to try and influence whoever is going to be in there. But I know that civil society in Zimbabwe feels that it would be easier to work with the MDC. They're already committed to constitutional reform. They have a very close relationship with civil society, so they're hoping and backing. They're hoping for an MDC win and backing the MDC, and but anything else could happen. And then certainly, if Mugabe is gone, I think there will be opportunities to influence whoever does come in.
Thanks, Gugu. Christina, any last thoughts?
Just be very quick. I think, well, one of the big frustrations over the last few years has been the failure of other African countries to censor Mugabe, and in fact, not only that, but to actually give him standing ovations at international meetings. I think that has changed a bit. I mean, for the first time, we have seen other African leaders coming out and criticising Mugabe, and Mugabe has been very clever at presenting what he's done in Zimbabwe as a fight against the colonialists, when clearly what he's been doing is a fight to keep himself in power, and he doesn't really care what he does to his own people to achieve that. So I hope that finally we're seeing other African countries waking up to that as what he's really doing. I'm not sure, having said that, that what Mbeki really could have achieved in those negotiations, because what pressure can he put on Mugabe? Mugabe doesn't care. He doesn't care what happens to his country. He doesn't care if there's no electricity or if there's no food, or so that makes it very difficult to negotiate with him. And on civic society, I mean, I'm endlessly impressed by people that carry on there, the lawyers, the human rights activists. It, I think, is the most documented crisis that I've ever come across. But sadly, it's very frustrating because there are all these people documenting all the things that are happening, but what are they doing with it? And that makes it very, very frustrating, I think, for those people. I think Mugabe, too, has been clever in splitting some of these groups, and it's not just the political parties. He's managed to divide the lawyers, he's managed to divide the church. I mean, even now this crazy situation with the Anglican church in Harare, which is quite unbelievable, with the Kanonga having been told to go by an Anglican church but refusing and staying, occupying the cathedral. So it's hard to see any hope, really, in the short term, I'm afraid.
Depressing note to end the discussion on. I'd like to thank the panel very much for a hugely informative and entertaining evening, and I guess people can continue the discussion in the bar afterwards.